Hi, I'm Candice Malcolm, and this is the Candice Malcolm Show. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. I hope you had a wonderful weekend. Hopefully, you had a chance to reconnect, to have some downtime with your family and with your loved ones. Okay, we have a ton of news to get to. I'm going to run through everything that's happening in the world of Canadian federal news. We're going to talk about Justin Trudeau and his so-called hot mic moment on Friday. We'll talk about Pierre Poilievre's reaction, talk about Mark Carney and how he's gaining in the polls, talk about the media reaction to everything that's happening, because I think a lot of it is being manufactured to benefit the Liberal Party of Canada, to benefit Mark Carney, and to make sure that we continue to have Liberal rule in this country. And we're going to talk about the Liberal leadership race as well. And for this episode, I'm really pleased to be joined by a friend of mine named Paige McPherson. Paige is the Associate Director of Education Policy at the Fraser Institute. Prior to joining Fraser Institute, you might remember her. She was the Alberta Director of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, went on to become the Atlantic Director because her family moved from Alberta all the way out to the East Coast. And prior to that, another Sun alumni joining the show, Paige McPherson was a TV host and a politics reporter back in the day at the Sun News Network. So Paige, thank you so much for joining the podcast today.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I'm happy to be here.
And Paige and I are part of a very special club because we are both moms of four little kids as well. I think, Paige, your newest is only 3 months old. So congratulations on that.
Yes, thank you. It's the best club to be in.
It is. I know. I love being a mom. I think being a reporter, being a journalist is like the best job. But being a mom is just like the most important thing that a woman can do, and definitely the most important part of my life. So we'll get to that. We're going to talk about mom stuff later in the episode, but let's start by talking about politics. So I'm going to start by walking the viewers through what has happened. So Friday, we had our interview with Preston Manning. Go check out that episode. It was really interesting to hear. I think Preston is like the godfather of populism and the sort of grassroots conservative movement in Canada. So many of the things happening in the US, I think, have already happened in Canada, like a great populist awakening. It happened in Canada in the 90s, and it's happening with Trump and the Make America Great Again movement. So anyway, interesting episode. I encourage you to check that out. Yes, around the same time as we were filming, Justin Trudeau was speaking to an economic summit in Toronto. So he was speaking to nearly 200 business, industry, and union leaders. At one point during this conference or summit, he told the media to get out of the room. So he ushered media out, and then he basically told the crowd what he really thought. And we call this a hot mic moment, even though I think that it was all deliberate. I think that he knew that someone in the audience would be recording, or that the media would find a way to continue to record him. That's exactly what happened, because pretty much every media outlet reported it right away. They didn't have, it perfectly on screen in a camera. We're going to show it to you, but everybody got the audio. So Trudeau can be heard saying that when President Donald Trump is talking about annexing Canada and making Canada the 51st state, it is not a joke. He is serious. He actually really does want to absorb Canada. And the reason is his desire to obtain our country's critical minerals. So here is how the CBC put it together. You'll see Justin Trudeau up on stage, and you'll see how he tells the media to go. And then they have the audio footage of what he said at that point. So let's play that clip.
Ask our friends from the media to please, but Mr. Trump has it in mind that one of the easiest ways of doing that is absorbing our country. And it is a real thing. In my conversation with him
So you could hear him say, I know it was kind of hard to see, but he's basically saying that Trump is serious. And in his conversations, he's serious about it. He says that I'd suggest that not only does the Trump administration know how many critical minerals we have, but that may be very much a part of why they keep talking about absorbing us and making us the 51st state. And so you can see our friend JJ McCullough, he commented about this on X, and he said, this is deranged conspiracy mongering from Trudeau. I suspect he has absolutely zero evidence for believing this. And so you kind of have to wonder, why is Trudeau out there talking about this all of a sudden? Because recall that over the last month, whenever it came to talking about Trump, he would just kind of laugh it off. He would say that Trump isn't being that serious, that this is just part of the negotiation, and he didn't take it that seriously. And then here, all of a sudden, February 7th, he's out there saying, no, this is actually really serious. And they want Canada because they want our minerals. I think that it has something to do with Steve Bannon. So I mentioned this on my show with Preston Manning on Friday. On Thursday, Steve Bannon, who was a former senior Trump advisor, sort of one of the main leading people in the MAGA movement back in 2016. He's not really involved in the campaign, from best I can tell, or in the administration at this point, but he was quite involved before. He was on Global News in Canada, and he was talking about how Canada, especially the Arctic and the North, is what it's all about. The geopolitical war or whatever we're shaping up here between the great superpowers of the world, China, Russia, the United States, it's all going to be about access to the North. And he was talking about the geopolitical importance, the strategic importance of the North and about Canada. So I want to play this clip. This is from Thursday, February 6th.
China and Russia, the great powers, and the United States fighting it out over the Arctic. With the vast resources of the Arctic is going to be the new great game of the 21st century. Canada, you are thrust into the middle of that. And quite frankly, you are the greatest, I don't know if target or prize. You're like asking, you're the great prize of that.
So that's Steve Bannon. We can cut it there. That's Steve Bannon talking about it. And it was just the very next day, right, that Trudeau was out there saying that actually it's all about minerals and we should take Trump very seriously when he's talking about annexing Canada. Now, I think that this is all sort of manufactured and drummed up. I think that the media would much rather be talking about Donald Trump, that we're coming into an election. Presumably an election is going to happen very soon. And I think that the elites, the media, the liberals would all rather be talking about Trump than talking about Canada, than talking about what has happened in our country over the last 10 years under Justin Trudeau liberal rule, whether it's crime, whether it's safety on our streets, immigration, cost of living, inflation, whether it's talking about spending and balancing the budgets and the outlook for our economy. I don't think that they want to talk about any of that, because on any of those issues, conservatives win. But if the issue of the election is about Donald Trump, is about who can stand up for Canada, polls actually show us that Canadians trust the Liberals more on this issue. So the Globe and Mail put out a piece on Friday saying that Canadians believe that Mark Carney would be better than Pierre Poilievre in dealing with Trump. And so that was a poll conducted by Nanos Research in the field from January 31st to February 3rd. It showed that about 40% of Canadians believe that Mark Carney is the most qualified to negotiate with Trump. Only 26% of Canadians consider Mr. Poilievre the best for that role, and then 12% for Chrystia Freeland. So it really makes you wonder that, is this whole thing just kind of manufactured? It seems like it was pretty coordinated, that Trudeau decided, hey, I'm going to make it about, I'm going to talk about minerals. I'm going to talk about how the fact that the United States are actually serious about taking us over. It just so happens that that's an issue that the Liberals do very well on. Now, I know, Paige, you focus on education policy at the Fraser Institute, and probably, I don't know if you want to comment on all of the politics behind it, but what do you take about the idea that Canadians are heading to the polls, heading to election, presumably? Like, what do you think the main issue facing Canadians should be?
Yeah, it's really interesting, as sort of a policy wonk type, observing this discussion that's been going on and all the kind of hysteria over the sort of the trade issue and the back and forth and how it's been covered in the media. And it's obviously no secret that in Canada, we like to really heavily focus on what's happening in the US and focus on Donald Trump, and we're so culturally influenced. But when this trade tariff issue was going on, for example, I think there was a few of us that were sort of banging our heads against the wall saying a number of things, like, wouldn't a pipeline be nice right now? Pipelines that were not approved, that would make us more energy independent as a country, and make it easier as well for us to export our product to other markets. We're heavily dependent on the United States. Wouldn't that be nice right now? But that goes to, years and years of regulatory policy around the oil sands, around mining, all of these different projects, that don't get off the ground because of government intervention, because it isn't really an investment-friendly environment, stuff like that. There's also, supply management in Canada. Like, wouldn't that be a nice thing to talk about, the supply management of our dairy products that makes dairy products for Canadian families so much more expensive than families in the United States that have a more open market? Why aren't we talking about that? There's also interprovincial trade barriers. I mean, it's pretty frustrating that we're talking about trade with the US, which is obviously extremely important. It's our largest trading partner, but we have, barriers that exist between our own provinces. Let's talk about tearing some of those down. And then, of course, the issue of taxes and just the fact that we have a real challenge around economic growth in this country that we need to get a hold of. And, we've got out of control inflation as a result of government spending, and that really just has not been controlled in a number of years. And that goes to all levels of government. But there's also the tax environment, where we do see a really high tax burden relative to other jurisdictions. That brings into question, why would businesses invest in Canada versus other places? So there's all these different policy issues that are happening, here at home. And the media covers often what's kind of sexy and what's in your face, but there are, I think, really important considerations that people have here at home. And ultimately, what I think, the people that we talk to in our lives, but also just looking, I think it's pretty common sense here in Canada that cost of living is the big thing for Canadians, whether it's housing or groceries or the tax burden. At the Fraser Institute, we look at the tax burden on Canadians and that being actually higher than the necessities of life, that Canadians are actually paying more taxes than they're spending on the other necessities of life. So those things have really snowballed out of control. And I think there's a lot of politics, but that's really what I think it boils down to for the average family around the kitchen table.
I hope you're right. I hope that when Canadians go to the polls, and I think it might end up being sooner than we previously thought, and we'll get to that in a minute. I hope that they go to the polls and vote based on who can make your life better in terms of standard of living, in terms of all of the terrible economic policies that we've endured for the last decade. I mean, it's remarkable for me, Paige, to look at. I think one of the Fraser Institute reports showed all of the North American jurisdictions, so all of the states and all of the provinces, and the Canadian provinces are all taxed at a much higher rate than even the most high tax American jurisdictions. And then when you look at the sort of cost of living, the average income, the average GDP per capita, the American states almost all do better than even the wealthiest of the Canadian provinces. And it's just so sad to see what's happened to Canada over just a decade. It wasn't that long ago when Stephen Harper was a prime minister that Canada was lauded as this middle-class paradise. We had the richest middle class in the world. And it seems like that's slipped away. I hope that Canadians remember that when they go to the ballot box. But seeing, specifically this one poll where Canadians do maybe perhaps prefer someone like Mark Carney, someone who has a lot of experience sort of in the top role, the governor of the Bank of Canada, and involved in the World Economic Forum. I guess to 40% of Canadians, that's a positive, and that's the kind of person that they want negotiating with Trump. Now, I want to show a CTV compilation. This was put together by ex-user called Government Corrupt, and he put together this little compilation of CTV News kind of promoting this idea that this will be the ballot box issue, who can best handle Trump and who can better negotiate a deal here. And they also suggest that Mark Carney is going to be the one to pull the plug and force an election, that it's not going to, we've been talking a lot on the show about theories that maybe Mark Carney will become prime minister, make a deal with Jagmeet Singh, try to govern for a year maybe before calling an election. People on CTV are suggesting that's not what's going to happen. Mark Carney is reading these polls. He's seeing that this might be as good as it gets for him, and we might be going into an election very soon. So let's play this clip. This is all from Sunday, February 9th, by the way.
I guess the question I have for you, Nick, is you also did some polling on how Canadians view who is best suited to handle Trump. How much do you think that does end up being the ballot box question, and how much does that depend on timing?
Well, I think it probably will be the ballot box question in the next federal election, because the thing is that for Canadians, they know that our relationship with the U.S. is critical. And I think, who knows, maybe people in the next election are not going to vote for a party that they like, might not vote for a leader that they trust or whatever, but they just might vote for whoever they think might be best able to manage that situation.
The next Liberal leader will be elected on March the 9th, may choose to take Canadians to the polls right away.
Okay, so you can see her saying they might choose to take her to the polls. Right after that, Vasi said that she's also hearing that if Mark Carney wins and when he wins, he is not even going to go back, not even going to reconvene the House of Commons. He's just going to call an election right away. I think that they have been looking at the polls and seeing that, when it comes to this issue of negotiating with Trump, they trust the Liberals more. I want to take this to what Pierre Poilievre had to say on Friday. So shortly after that video of Trudeau happened, Pierre Poilievre was on an interview with the Toronto Sun's Brian Lilley. And in this interview, he said that he has always taken Trump seriously and that basically this is a real thing. We really need to be concerned over the idea that Trump wants to annex Canada. So let's play that clip.
Well, I've always taken it seriously, and I've always clearly and consistently condemned it. Canada will never be the 51st state. We will be a strong, independent, sovereign country when I'm prime minister. That's exactly why it's so unfortunate that the Carney-Trudeau Liberals have made us so weak and reliant on the Americans. Their radical tax increases have driven $500 billion into the American economy out of Canada, including of many of Mr. Carney's own investments.
The headlines coming out of that interview were the beginning part of that, where Poilievre says he's always taken Trump's threats seriously. And when I saw that, I thought, okay, he's kind of playing into this narrative that the Liberals and the media have so cleverly created, that this election the focus needs to be on Trump, needs to be on this annexing, and not on the actual issues facing everyday Canadians with our pocketbooks in everyday life. You can see in the second part of that clip, I think Pierre did quite well, where he was emphasizing the cost of living and how the Liberals really hurt Canada and how that's hurting our pocketbook and our bottom line. But of course, the headline coming out, Pierre takes this threat seriously. And I don't know that is the best message for the Conservatives. So Paige, I'll put it to you. How do you think that the Conservatives should be managing this? And I know you don't want to talk too much about politics, but what do you make of this whole situation?
I think so. Here's what I hear from people when I'm talking about, because obviously this is dominating the news. Does Trump really want to take over Canada? Is this really going to happen? Like, how seriously, should we take him? I've read The Art of the Deal myself. A book that Trump wrote years ago on his sort of tactics that he uses in negotiations. I know you've talked about that on this show before, Candice, and sort of that was my take on it as well. Was this is a negotiation? He's doing what in sort of the policy or advocacy world sometimes call, shifting the Overton window. Let's shift the goalpost of the conversation. I'm going to come out way over here, and we're going to meet somewhere in the center, but the center is going to have shifted closer to what I really want the outcome to be. So it was sort of always my impression as I'm, observing Trump and seeing that situation going on. But what's funny to me when I talk to people just, who are also watching the news and trying to gauge whether or not they should take it seriously is everyone's like, oh, gee, well, I really don't want to be a 51st state, but gosh, those tax levels would be great. Or I don't really want to be a 51st state, but gosh, I'd love to be able to choose my kids' school, or I'd love to, have more choice in grocery stores and stuff like that. Like those things where Canadians are cognizant of those quality of life differences. The United States is so close to us. And, some of the stats that you and I were talking about, just a couple minutes ago, you can see that, the per person GDP is doing better. Their take home pay is better. Their taxes are lower, but their services are not impacted on so many different levels. And so that to me is sort of the great irony in all of this is that, when I think Canadians are sort of thinking about the idea of our neighbor to the south and, in sort of a comparative way, there are so many things that we could capture and accomplish here in Canada as well, while also having the added bonus of realizing that, we are competing with our neighbor for investment, and creating a better environment for investment is going to create more growth, create more jobs, bring more people to Canada who want to create those jobs. And ultimately that's going to be better for everybody, or just allow people, here in Canada to create those jobs in ways that they may not be able to now because it's just too cost prohibitive. So that's what, I always obviously hope that policy is going to dominate elections, but it doesn't always. A lot of times there is this kind of like heated rhetoric and nationalism that gets, let's say, trumped up, and that's what ends up being the dominating issue. But if politicians of all stripes can bring it back to the fact that we really are facing very economically challenging times in Canada, and there needs to be pretty significant policy shifts on a whole bunch of fronts to bring that growth back, because growth really is the big challenge. That's ultimately what I would like to see. But here I am. I don't know if that's what the outcome is going to be, because you and I know politics very well, and the sober policy conversations are not always what wins the day.
Well, I think that this all just benefits the Liberals. I'll just say it again, because there is sort of this like irrational, like you're talking about how people at the end of the day might look at the United States and say, wow, there's a lot more competition. I could probably get a better cell phone plan. I could probably get cheaper flights if there was more competition. Like all of these different areas that are very much dominated in Canada by these sort of conglomerate or monopolies that are made up because they're Canadian, we would have a lot more access to competition. So when you're thinking kind of rationally, it's like, oh, having some kind of a deeper integration economically or an economic union would be good. But the irrational side is like the patriotism, like the like in your heart, in your soul, like I love Canada, and it drives me crazy to hear this American president talking about taking us over. And I think that that's what the Liberals are tapping into, that irrational side, saying like, how dare he? We love Canada. So like, forget about the actual improvements that could happen if we had more economic union. Think about, I don't know how many people are seriously thinking about the 51st state thing. It is interesting though, Paige, that True North did a poll, and it found that especially young men, nearly half of young men said that they would take American citizenship if Trump offered it to him, according to our poll. And there's been other polls that have put that out there. And it's interesting because when I posted on social media, a lot of the replies, especially from people on the left and liberals, they say, oh, these young men are traitors. Like, how dare they turn their back on their country? But I think that at the end of the day, many people, especially younger men, that younger demographic, are not thinking about it in the irrational, like love of country, nationalism, or patriotism sense. They're literally just thinking, how can I have a good life for myself and my family? And maybe looking around at the cost of living, cost of buying a house in Toronto or Vancouver, it's just not in the cards. And so you think about the fact that, hey, if I moved to Utah, I could probably buy a house for like $300,000. I could get a job that pays me more. I'd have less taxes. It might actually be good. It'd be sad to leave Canada. But at the end of the day, economics is a driver of a lot of decisions. So I do kind of wonder, like, I think that the political wedge of Trump in the 51st state is really good for the Liberals, and that's why the Liberals in the media are playing it up so much. But at the end of the day, the economics of it could become more compelling. I'm going to keep going with the news here because I want to get to all of this. So to add even more elements to this and to make it even more interesting, Donald Trump himself commented on this. So yesterday was the Super Bowl. I don't know if you watched the Super Bowl page, but it was Super Bowl Sunday, and the president did a special sit-down interview. I guess it's been many years since there was an actual Super Bowl day interview with the president. Biden declined to do it. And Trump went to the Super Bowl. I guess he's the first president ever to go to the Super Bowl. So it was kind of a fun cultural moment happening down in the States. But during this whole day of festivities, Trump sat down with Fox News' Bret Baier for a special pre-Super Bowl interview. And Baier asked Trump specifically about Trudeau, about this comment that he made on a hot mic, and asked Trump to respond to it. So we're going to play that clip for you.
The Prime Minister said this weekend to a group of Canadian businessmen, he was at a private meeting, he said that your wish for Canada to be the 51st state is a, quote, real thing. Is it a real thing?
Yeah, it is. I think Canada would be much better off being a 51st state because we lose $200 billion a year with Canada, and I'm not going to let that happen.
Page, Trump doubles down. I don't think he's going to walk away from the comments, right? So Trudeau wants us to think that this is real, and Trump says, "You bet it's real." And then he goes back into his statement that he said many times that basically we lose $200 billion a year to Canada. I'm not going to let that happen. It's too much. Why are we paying $200 billion a year? Essentially, it's subsidies to Canada. Now, if they're the 51st state, I don't mind doing it. So playing into all this. And then again, it leads us to this idea, like, do we take this literally? Obviously, we should take it seriously because he keeps talking about it. But does he literally want to take our country? Republican Senator Ted Cruz waved it all off on a podcast over the weekend. He's just calling this an epic troll. And he says all about yanking Trudeau's chain. Meanwhile, it gave Mark Carney the opportunity to swoop in and do apparently what Canadians think he does best. He wrote on X saying, what part of no don't you understand? No, we will never give in to a bully. Canada will always be the true north, strong and free. And then while flying to the Super Bowl, so he's on the plane on Air Force One, flying from, I guess, Washington, D.C. down to New Orleans, Trump again was asked about this question. He talks about how the United States is about to get even larger, again, alluding to this idea that they're going to take over Canada. Let's play that clip.
We're making our country larger, We're making our country stronger. And in the case of Canada, if this should happen, I don't know how they can do it without us, because without the U.S., Canada really doesn't have a country.
Canada doesn't really have a country without the U.S. I think he's talking militarily. I don't know exactly where he gets the $200 billion subsidies. I don't know if you have any comment on that, Paige.
I don't know. I also am curious about that comment as well. I'm not really sure if he's talking about, Canada's maybe NATO commitments not being met, or, the U.S., having the military might that Canada certainly doesn't have, and us kind of benefiting from that reliance and that relationship. I'm not sure. And again, it's, I'm not well suited to know if this is him negotiating, and this is a negotiation tactic, and he's just going to play it out until they're, because he knows that he's not ultimately going to be negotiating with our current prime minister. He's going to be negotiating with somebody else. So maybe he's stretching it out to that. I don't know. But what I do know, or what would be nice, is if this sparked a conversation about how can we be stronger as a country, and ultimately you have to you can't save the world if you can't pay the rent, right? So you have to get your economic house in order, and that's what I'm hoping that Canadian policymakers of all stripes will take away from this, is that if you want to be in a position of strength, if you're feeling that there's a bully in this situation, then get your economic house in order, and get Canadians who have a large share of household debt as well, that are facing Canadian families, get them in a position of strength, allow them to feel that strength as well, and share the benefits of some economic growth by getting better policies in line, because right now we're quite behind the times, relative to the US, and especially, as President Trump moves forward with, he's reducing the size of government in some ways. He's reducing what he sees as sort of redundancies in the bureaucracy or in government programs. Talking about creating a better tax environment. I'm not exactly sure where he's going to go in terms of the mix between tariffs and other taxes, but certainly he's talking about reducing the tax burden on Americans. So these are things that, if Canadians in this 51st state conversation, let's get our house in order. Let's focus on some tax relief and policies that are going to better Canadians as well. If you're feeling, that there's a bully, that's a good response.
Well, I just think that this is the perfect wedge issue against the Conservatives that the Liberals have been hoping and praying for, because you're right. Canada is basically at the weakest that I think we've been in a very, very long time. And Trump senses that. So Trump sees a weak country. Trump sees a divided country. Trump sees the drastic shift in cost of living and standard of living that we've been talking about, Paige. And I think that he is picking up on that and tapping into it. And whether you call that a bully or a wise, shrewd businessman and negotiator, whatever it is, I think he's tapping into something. And the best thing for Canada that we can do to stand a chance in fighting off this, whether it's a real threat or not, I don't think it is. I think it's all part of the negotiation. But whether it is, the best thing we can do is create a stronger country. But again, just to go back to that idea that with Mark Carney, with this one issue, the media is really, really going into overdrive to make Canadians think that this is a serious impeding threat that's going to happen, that kind of like Canada is like Czechoslovakia and it's March 1939 and we're about to be invaded. And I think that is the best thing for the Liberals, and we see it. So if you just look at the recent polls, the Liberals have risen. This is just since January. This is pretty incredible. So 8 points. An 8-point gain for the Liberal Party since January, and the Conservatives saw a 5-point drop. So, of course, the Conservatives are still in majority territory, according to these polls, 41% and 28% for the Liberals. So it's not like the Liberals would step in and win a majority. But, that shift that's happening, whatever it is, a 13-point swing in just a month, like if those trends continue, we very much might see another Liberal minority government if we were to go to the polls right away. I want to move on over to the Liberal leadership campaign, because there was an interesting story over the weekend that we learned that a Chinese-linked malicious WeChat campaign against Chrystia Freeland was alerted. This was also happening on Friday. So you can see the National Post headline here, which is that China is basically trying to interfere with the Liberal leadership race. We've been warning about this potentially happening on the show for weeks now, and here we see that it actually has happened. So that Canadian Ministry of Democratic Institutions put out a statement on Friday as follows. It says, Rapid Response Mechanisms Canada detects informational operation targeting a candidate for the leadership campaign of the Liberal Party of Canada. And then we learned that it was Chrystia Freeland, basically a bunch of targeted messages that were seen by apparently millions of Canadians, 3 million Canadians, that were not true. I don't know exactly what they were saying, but Freeland responded by saying, responding to the revelation on X, she wrote, "I will not be intimidated by Chinese foreign interference. Having spent years confronting authoritarian regimes, I know firsthand the importance of defending our freedoms. Canada's democracy is strong. My thanks to our national security agencies for protecting it." And then it gave Mark Carney the opportunity to jump in as well. He wrote this on X: "I fully support Chrystia Freeland and her campaign. In light of this disturbing report, I am fully committed to defending the integrity of this race and stand firm against any attempts to undermine our democracy. My deepest gratitude to the national security and intelligence officials who lead this important work to sustain trust in our democratic process." Not really sure, Paige, that this gives us a lot of hope in our democratic institutions and the process, but I will just point something out, that this was happening in Canada during the 2021 election. We know that there were coordinated WeChat campaign attacks against Conservatives and against Erin O'Toole that potentially even swayed the results of that election in 2021. And there was no rapid response. There was no government pointing it out in real time saying, hey, we just caught the Chinese trying to do this. They just ignored it, let it happen, let the election play out. And then we found out about it later on in reports. So it's kind of interesting that when it comes to a Liberal, the federal bureaucracy is so willing to swing in and stop it in real time. And then also sort of the broader issue that the Chinese are actively trying to sway our elections. As a Canadian, like what do you think when you hear stories like this?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, this is pretty above my pay grade. But I do think that there are just so many of these stories that, I think that a lot of people are seeing this, and it's almost noise in the background, and it's sort of disconnected from, like, these are like larger geopolitical issues, but it is a bit disconnected from, I think, what Canadians are experiencing every day. And that's what, I hope that there is just more of a focus, like renewed focus. It does feel that in the last short while, we have really, there was a lot of talk, even from the Liberal leadership candidates, about things like cost of living, about the things that Canadians are facing day to day. And the conversation has shifted quite dramatically in the last few weeks. And I'm hoping that, the former does not get lost in all of this. But again, it probably comes down to, what we were just talking about, which is that, like, we really need to get our house in order, and we need to regain strength as a country. And that would give, I think, Canadians some renewed faith in all of these different institutions. But in terms of commenting on the specifics of this, again, a little bit outside my purview.
Well, I mean, it is kind of interesting that all of the stories in the news right now have something to do with Canada's integrity as a country and our sovereignty. And I think that really, it's a sad reflection on just how weak Canada is in so many ways. People on X and Canadians were also quick to point out that Mark Carney himself has some ties to communist China and Xi. So almost immediately after the hack story came out, this photo started circulating on X. Here is Stephen Taylor, a conservative activist, reminding everybody that Mark Carney had met with Chinese Premier Xi Jinping. So just for some more context, that meeting happened back in March of 2024, back when Mark Carney was the governor of the Bank of England, and they met during basically some kind of a CEO retreat. And so, not a great look, I think, for Mark Carney when he's trying to become the Canadian Prime Minister, trying to sound tough on China, trying to talk about how, he fully supports Chrystia Freeland as her campaign is being targeted by misinformation or disinformation from the Chinese. And that picture is circulating around. Not the best look. Okay, I want to move on, Paige, because I know that you focus on education in your day job. You've got 4 great little kids, and so it's obviously a pressing matter for you. I saw this video circulating. Apparently, it was a year old, but still, I think the story still remains kind of shocking to see a bunch of Canadian Marxist teenagers and young people just cheering and celebrating some kind of a Marxist school. So let's play this clip for you. Yeah, so I mean, on the one hand, they're pretty happy. It's nice to see optimistic young Canadians. You know, I hear from so many Canadians that are filled with sort of despair and grief about the future. So on the one hand, it's great to see some jolly young people in Canada, but on the other hand, I just can't believe how brainwashed these students are to be, you know, joyously celebrating Marxism. What do you make of all that, Paige?
Yeah, not the school that I would pick for my children, the Marxist school. But this is interesting because what we focus on at the Fraser Institute primarily is K-12 education, or P-12, so kindergarten or primary to grade 12 education. But of course, that is just the precursor and what feeds into post-secondary education. And that's where you do end up seeing a lot of these types of wild videos or campaigns or things that go on on university and college campuses in Canada. And of course, this is the everybody can relate to an extent to, you know, you're not quite got maybe one foot in the real world, but you're not quite there. You're not quite paying taxes yet. You maybe don't have that full reality check. It might be, you know, your the days when you are maybe most vulnerable to the messages of Marxism. But there is, you know, politicization that happens at the K-12 level in Canadian schools as well. And I think really the central issue here is for parents, from the parent perspective, is, do I have a way to avoid this? Do I have a way to choose some kind of an education that is just quite simply neutral, that, you know, sets my kid up for success in the basics? So in K-12, that might be, you know, reading, writing, math, history understanding, those kind of core foundational building blocks, and then into university where they're going to choose a more specialized stream where they're not just going to be kind of flushing their money down the toilet, something that really sets them up for life, or at the very least isn't, you know, structured in some kind of like a Marxist indoctrination camp sort of a way. And I think that, you know, what we have seen, at least at the K-12 level, when we have done surveys at the Fraser Institute, for example, we did a survey last year, 2024, with Leger for the Fraser Institute, asking about how parents feel about controversial issues. So that might be responses to climate change or things like sex and gender, those kinds of conversations. How do you feel about those issues in your kids' K-12 schools? 76% of parents believe that kids should be presented both sides of controversial issues. 91% of parents, this is sort of a Canadian average, say that the age-appropriate materials are the only things that should be taught in K-12 schools. And 81% of parents believed that they should receive advance notice if controversial topics are being raised in their kids' schools. But we know that that doesn't always happen. I'm sure that your viewers and listeners remember not too long ago, it made headlines that there were Toronto area schools where kids were shipped to a protest that turned into, it was supposed to be kind of like an Indigenous rights protest or rally, and it turned into an anti-Israel rally. There were Jewish students there who reported being very uncomfortable but were made to stay. This is the kind of stuff that parents are sometimes finding out after the fact. We know that this is happening, you know, obviously at the university level, students have more autonomy, but what are the sort of the building blocks? What are the foundation stones of this? And do parents have a choice to opt out? And the reality is that, for example, in that case in Toronto, where there was that protest that the kids were taken to, no, not really. Like, unless you are of financial means, you have some choice within the public system in Ontario. You could choose to attend an English or French public school or English or French public Catholic school. But outside of that, unless you can afford to pay the full tuition at an independent school or have one parent stay home and homeschool your kids, there really isn't an opt-out option. And I think that's the real challenge here for Canadian families, at least in terms of how our surveys reflect this, because this is really the concern. You're setting kids up with this politicization in schools instead of just teaching them the basics of reading, writing, math, where we know kids are actually falling behind right across the country. What is that setting them up for then in university? And it certainly, at the very least, makes these kinds of videos less surprising to see.
Oh, there's so much to unpack there, Paige. Okay, so like when I look at the universities, like just my high level reaction is that these students are being brainwashed, and I don't understand why we're subsidizing them. Like, it's been 15 years since I was in university, but when I was there, it was overwhelmingly Marxist. Like the professors in the political science department at the University of Alberta were overwhelmingly pushing Marxism. If they weren't like outright Marxist, I can't imagine how much that's increased and intensified in the last 10 or 15 years. I guess it's been 10 years since I was in university, not 15. But still, like the idea that our taxpayers are funding these students to go get a higher education that we believe is necessary to have a career and a successful life in Canada. But a lot of times, especially if they're studying in the liberal arts in areas like political science or humanities, they're actually just getting brainwashed. And I don't understand why we're funding it. Is there any movement or any political talk or any sort of think tank work pointing towards the idea that we just shouldn't fund these universities? I think that conversation is happening more in the United States. I think it should happen in Canada. Like I think that individual young Canadians should get some kind of a grant from the government, whether they want to go into trade school, whether they want to start a business, whether they want to go get an academic education. That's up to them. But to me, I don't understand why we're choosing one area to subsidize. We're helping them pay for their university, but we're not helping them in other areas. So I want your thoughts on defunding the universities, and then we'll get into some of the other K-12 issues.
Right. So I do think that is a conversation that is definitely happening much more in the United States than it is in Canada. But what I can say is that there is a demand for different ideas that is perhaps not being met by traditional universities, which are very heavily subsidized in Canada. So at the Fraser Institute, we run education programs, and those education programs are often focused on sort of just like a basic education in economics and public policy. So you'll hear from people like myself and other staff and senior fellows that are associated with the Fraser Institute that give you an understanding of, like, I would talk about education policy. There might be specific policy topics, but also just that kind of like basic understanding of economics that really is a prerequisite to understanding the kind of broader political conversations that we just had. You can't really put those things in context unless you have an understanding of economics, unless you have an understanding of how the economy works, and all these sort of different areas. And that's what the education programs at the Fraser Institute seeks to provide students and also teachers. And there is a demand for it. There are lots of students out there that want to have that kind of an education that just are not accessing that kind of educational material through their traditional universities. So, take from that what you will. Should there be some more diversity, in how things are funded? I think that's a really interesting question. But I can tell you that for sure, the demand is there for some diversity of ideas.
Well, I hope the next government, whoever it is, will take this on, because again, like, university is not for everyone, and I think more and more it's not only not beneficial, but it's actually harmful to having a happy, successful life. I want to go back to what you were talking about a little bit with sort of radical ideologies taking over K-12 education. I know at True North we cover a lot of these kind of stories, and I'm constantly blown away by some of the stuff that's happening, especially in Ontario, especially in around Toronto. And I always kind of wonder, like, why do parents put up with this? Like, why is it, like, how is it, especially in some of these areas, Paige, where when you look at the photos that are taken or things that leak out of classrooms, a lot of the kids in the classroom are from immigrant families, and they're like people who probably have much more conservative political values than we do in Canada. And I don't understand why there's just so much radical ideology. And I'm talking about the gender confusion that's pushed on kids, this idea of like that Canada is somehow like a racist, genocidal country, or that white people are inherently bad and evil. I see so much of it, and it kind of blows me away. Like what can be done? You talked about how parents can choose to pull their kids out, but if we're looking at like really trying to rid this ideology out of schools? Like, where would we even begin?
Well, so part of the reason that we conducted the survey that we did last year in the first place is because we were hearing so many of these stories, right? There was a story out of New Brunswick. I live in Nova Scotia, so next door to where I am, where parents found out after the fact that an outside group had come to present to the kids. It was about sort of gender and sex. That was like the dominating ideas in this assembly, and that just a lot of parents, and I think very reasonably, believe that it was not age-appropriate material that was being delivered to their children, but they had no advance notice. So I think that, that's why we started asking these questions. Should you have advance notice? Should you be able to pull your child out if you don't agree with the material being presented after you've received this advance notice? And the majority of Canadians do, there is support for these things. Should the material be age appropriate, and should both sides be presented? So that's what most Canadians want. Canadian parents with kids in K-12 specifically want. And of course, parents can go to their schools and they can say, this is what I want, and hope for the best. But if you don't have the kind of influence that you want to have over your kid's school, if you don't have a system that facilitates parents of all income levels to be able to be informed customers of their kids' education, right? So be involved in their kids' schools, be an active participant, know what's happening if they want to, and ultimately be able to leave the school if it's not aligned with what they want, and have their tax dollars follow, or at least a portion of their tax dollars, which is how it works in 5 out of 10 Canadian provinces, follow their child to a different school of their choice. So British Columbia, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and Quebec all allow parents to send their child to an independent school, and a portion of their tax dollars will follow their child to that school. That at least, it doesn't make it accessible for every family, but it at least gives parents some ability to move their child and their child's tax dollars that are associated with that kid to a different school. So having those kinds of policies in place, I think, really helps. That's, of course, the opt-out option. In terms of the, do I stick with it and make my voice heard within the school? I think, parents are doing their best at the local level, and obviously that's why we think it's important to ask these questions and sort of broadcast this information from a public education point of view at the national level, to remind schools and provincial education ministries and school boards that these things actually matter to parents, and that it is your role to teach kids the basics, in education. It's not your role to have a political point of view. But oftentimes that is so lost.
I remember there was a post once by Chanel Pfaff, who's a great, she's a former educator, and now she's sort of a whistleblower at all. And she showed, I think it was a grade 3 or grade 4 classroom, exposing a teacher really just promoting radical ideology. And I shared the post, and the thing that I was most outraged by, obviously I was outraged that they were teaching 8 and 9-year-olds about sex, which is, I think, very inappropriate. But the math that was on the board was like so basic that my 4 and 5-year-old could do it. It was like basic addition. And I'm like, why are they doing this in grade 4? That's outrageous that the academics are just not keeping up. I want to tie it into this news story that True North is covering, also on your neck of the woods page just next door in Prince Edward Island. So a PEI counselor was sanctioned for putting up a mass graves is a hoax lawn sign, and the court is seeking the review. Now, if you look at the sign that they put up there, Sean, if we could just leave that back on, it says, truth, mass graves hoax, reconciliation is to redeem Sir John A's integrity. Redeem Sir John A's integrity. And I think that's such an interesting point. Like, good, first of all, good for this counselor for speaking up and, maintaining his freedom of speech, and the Canadian Constitution Foundation for representing him in the Supreme Court right now. But to get to the issue that he's talking about, part of the major irony of hearing the Liberals and the left right now celebrate Team Canada and talk about their deep and unabiding, unwavering love of Canada is in the wake of the last 5 years, when they've done everything they can to shame Canadians, to try to erase our history, shame us about our legacy, and try to take away Sir John A. Macdonald's accomplishments, particularly in school. So now young Canadians are taught that Sir John A. is the villain and the bad guy. So I think that part of this conversation really does need to be like, what can we teach our kids? What should kids know about Canada? That Canada is not this irredeemably racist country. Canada is actually a great country, and we should be celebrating that.
Right. Yeah. So one of the projects that we did last year or the year before at the Fraser Institute was undertake a review of the curricula, the history curricula from K to 12 in Ontario and British Columbia, and just see how much mandated content was in there. So content being names, dates, facts, providing, context around historical events, just simply teaching kids what happened in a way that makes sense, chronological sense, that kids can conceptualize it, right? And what we found is that there is shockingly little mandated content in social studies curricula in both BC and Ontario. In BC, really the only consistent theme of the history content that was taught was Canadian wrongdoing. Essentially, was a theme that came up. So different points in history in which the Canadian government has done something wrong, which, don't get me wrong, the Canadian government has done something wrong lots. That's an important part of history. But there were not a lot of other kind of mandated names, dates, facts, things that kids need to learn. So why does this matter? Because if you ask a child about Sir John A. Macdonald and you ask, should we be protesting him? Should we be tearing down his statue? Should we be doing these things? Do they know who he is? Do they know what he did? Do they know the context in which, the time in which he lived? Do they know what other people were doing? What historical events led up to the things that he did? What historical events followed? If you don't know this information, then you are not able to properly put it into context and understand it. So then you don't really have any understanding, and you don't really have an informed answer to those questions around what should be done with Sir John A. And any of those policies that happen, anything that we're dealing with today, how it reflects the policies of that time. And so that's why, it's really unfortunate that curricula in Canada have moved away from those really foundational building blocks of understanding. You need to know how to do the basics. You need to know how to do your times tables, for example, and then you can move on to more complex math. You need to know the names and dates of things, and then you can write a critical essay, saying that Sir John A. was a horrible person for such and such a reason. But you need to know what happened first, and that's what we've moved away from. And I want to just on that note, circle back to something that you mentioned right before you brought up this issue, which was around the math that was on the chalkboard. So from 2003 to 2022 being the most recent year that we have Program for International Student Assessments, which is sort of the gold standard skills standardized test, internationally speaking, and Canadian students at 15 years old write this test. Canadian students' math, the average from 2003 to 2022 has dropped by almost 2 years of learning. So basically the PISA equivalent of 2 years of learning have been lost in that period. So Canadian students, in terms of their math competency at age 15, are like 2 years behind where they were in 2003, and in reading about 1 year behind. So when you ask these questions about, how much of the day is being spent on this kind of like politicized content in schools, even if you're going to teach that kind of stuff, which Canadian parents don't seem to really agree that you should be, why aren't you spending more time bolstering Canadians' kids' knowledge of math and of reading and all of these skills that are so critical and what school is supposed to be about, where we're actually falling so far behind?
It's so unbelievable. I can't even, I mean, one of the saving kind of graces about there is a massive politicization of school, but when you look at Canadian students' academics, they're still stronger than so many other G7s or G20. And I kind of almost wonder if that is because of immigrant kids coming here that still put that emphasis, Chinese and Indian families put that emphasis on math in their own homes. And it's not necessarily the Canadian schools. When you hear data like that, it's kind of scary. Like the whole point of school should be making sure that kids understand the basics, math and literacy. And the fact that we're getting away from that is a concern. Well, patrons, have a few minutes left on the show here, and I want to talk about what's happening in the States. I know we talked a little bit more earlier in the show about Trump and how, when it comes to conservatives or even just Canadians, there's a lot of things that are happening down there that we're excited about, that we think are good, like taking a zero-based budgeting approach to the government and cutting all kinds of wasteful programs. I know Pierre Poilievre was up in the north today, and he was asked about foreign aid, and he talked about how we should be spending our money in Canada and not abroad. One of the things I'm most excited about when it comes to what the Trump administration is doing is the Make America Healthy Again movement and the involvement of Robert F. Kennedy Jr., RFKJ. I think there's a big awakening happening in the culture. So not just in the United States, but across Canada too, where people are being a lot more aware of what we're eating, the things that are in our food, the things that we're giving to our kids, like the dyes that are put in so many of the kids' foods, the amount of sugar and processed grains and seed oils in kids' foods, questions about vaccines, questions about schools. It's really making a lot of people aware of what is happening. And I know you're sort of interested in this topic along with myself. Do you see a movement like Make America Healthy Again happening in Canada? Do you hear a lot about these issues from your mom friends? I hear a lot about it from my mom friends, especially, a lot of things, the health stuff, but also concern about the radical left-wing woke ideology that's being inserted into schools. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are on this movement.
I do think that there is a shift that does seem to be happening where people are just wanting information. So on the school side, I think it actually started during COVID lockdown, schools being shut down for such a long period of time in Canada, which, by the way, is likely accounts for why kids have been, or at least partially why kids are so set back in Canada, but also in the other countries that you're talking about, other developed countries with we compare our test scores. But basically what happened was schools shut down, people were at home with their kids, they were watching what their kids were learning on screens, right? When you had this sort of virtual school, which didn't go very well for a large number of children. And parents kind of started to clue in and realize, gee, like, I can't believe that you're not sort of hitting these sort of basic foundational building blocks in your education, and started to kind of wake up a little bit to maybe what their kids were learning in schools and where the deficits were. Since then, I do think that there has been sort of a growth in I guess you could call it an awakening, right? Where certainly my mom friends and what we hear from people on the ground is that I really didn't realize that it was like this in school, and now I want to be a much more informed customer. I'm not exactly, maybe it was the same thing that triggered this movement in the US around the sort of Make America Healthy Again movement and the similar movements that we're seeing in Canada, where people are realizing, like, gee, I didn't really realize that these products were so unhealthy. And that it's just so difficult to find products on the shelves that don't have these ingredients, these additives in them, whether it's dyes or seed oils or whatever it is, right? And just parents, and even if people, are fine with consuming those, I do think that there is sort of a shift toward people wanting to know. I just would like to know the ingredients, please. And that is certainly something that is different. I mean, I have always been a read the ingredients mom, but I do think that I feel less fringe in that regard as of late.
I feel almost helpless when I go into a grocery store, like just even, for instance, trying to buy bread. I remember once I was walking through the grocery store, all I wanted was bread that had like less than 10 ingredients. And I literally, I was at a healthy grocery store just outside Toronto, and I picked up like 40 different loaves of bread, and I couldn't find anything that didn't have a bunch of additives that I couldn't pronounce. So I didn't know what they were. And that was the point where I'm like, okay, I guess I have to bake my own bread. And I do. I have my own sourdough starter on the counter. I do it with the kids. They love to get involved in it. It's a lot of work, but it's fun and I like it. And it got to that point where I'm like, so many of the things that we assume are kind of healthy aren't. And if you don't want to give those things to your kids, it's harder to. I'll tell you what radicalized me. And I know we just have a minute left here. You might not want to comment on this, but I was always very high trust when it came to my doctor and my hospital. I really, when it came to my labors and pregnancies, I put a lot of trust into my OB, my doctor. And it was after COVID when they were recommending that my 3-month-old baby get the COVID vaccine. And that was like a moment of like, well, wait a minute. As a journalist, I report a lot on this. I've read the research. I understand the data. Little kids don't get COVID. And if they do, it doesn't harm them. Like, the risk of death is so small for a child to get COVID. The fact that you're recommending that I get this COVID vaccine for my child which now, the Alberta government put out that report last week that said that they don't actually recommend it for kids. But the fact that my own doctor and my hospital were recommending that really made me stop and think, like, if I don't trust you on this, and I think you're giving me bad advice on this, like, what else should I not trust you on? And I think that is maybe what led a lot of parents to say, I have to take my health and my kids' health into my own hands. And I'm optimistic that they'll make some positive changes in the US, and hopefully that'll have a downstream effect on us in Canada as well. Did you have any last words on that one, Paige?
I just think it was the same with schools, right? When people were saying you can't have your kids in school because of this, there was a lot of people, maybe like you and like me, who work with data all the time, and we're looking at it and thinking, the risk to my kids of this many years of lost learning is high. The risk to my kids of this virus seems low. And unfortunately, a lot of people came to that realization after the fact. But here we are, and I do think that was the springboard. Those little moments for each family might have been different specific issues, whether it was schools or health products or whatever. But just wanting to become more informed and just a more informed consumer.
Excellent. Well, Paige McPherson, such a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us on the show today. Really appreciate the conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much.
All right. And thank you so much for tuning in. I'm Candice Malcolm. This has been the Candice Malcolm Show. We'll be back again tomorrow with all of the news. Thank you and God bless.